name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 8 years I've been invisible to my own family. Not because I disappeared, not because I moved away, but because the day I chose truth over loyalty, they decided I no longer existed. Standing in the marble corridors of Riverside County Courthouse on that gray Tuesday morning in October, watching my relatives file past me like I was furniture, I understood something crucial. Sometimes being erased isn't punishment, sometimes it's preparation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes everyone look sick. My Uncle David Chen walked past me without acknowledgement, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the polished floor with the confidence of a man who owned everything he touched. Behind him, my cousin Michael shuffled papers in a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My Aunt Linda clutched a designer purse against her chest like armor, her eyes scanning the hallway for threats that didn't include the one standing 3 feet away from her. They were dressed for victory. Tailored suits, coordinated colors, the kind of unified front that money buys and practice perfects. I wore a simple black dress from Target and carried a manila folder that contained 8 years of patient documentation. The contrast wasn't accidental. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them confident. I wanted them to underestimate exactly how much I remembered, and exactly how long I'd been preparing for this moment. The courtroom smelled like old wood and anxiety. Judge Patricia Williams presided from behind a massive oak bench that seemed to dwarf everyone who approached it, though she herself was barely 5 feet tall. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the case files spread before her. She had a reputation for fairness and an absolute intolerance for games, which was why I'd been quietly hoping she'd be assigned to this case for months. My family's attorney, James Parker, was everything you'd expect from a man who charged $800 an hour. Silver hair perfectly styled, suit that fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body, and a voice that could make reading a grocery list sound like a closing argument. He'd been the Chen family lawyer for 15 years, had helped them navigate 3 previous inheritance disputes, and had never lost a case involving family assets. Today, he was confident that streak would continue. The case was simple on paper. My grandmother, Rebecca Martinez, had died 6 months earlier at the age of 87. Her will, written 3 years before her death, left her entire estate to be divided among her surviving family members. The house in Woodland Hills, worth approximately $2.3 million. The investment portfolio, valued at just over $400,000. The family business shares, generating roughly $60,000 annually in passive income. Everything split evenly between her son David, her granddaughter Linda, and her 2 granddaughters, myself and my sister Emma. Except my family had decided that I shouldn't receive anything. Their argument was creative, I'll give them that. According to the petition Parker had filed, I had abandoned the family, shown no interest in maintaining relationships, and had caused significant emotional distress through my absence and hostility. They claimed that my grandmother had expressed regret about including me in the will, that she'd spoken about changing it but hadn't gotten around to the paperwork before her death. They had witness statements, they had documentation of my minimal contact with the family, and they had a detailed accounting of every family gathering I'd missed over the past 8 years. What they didn't have was the truth. Judge Williams called the court to order at precisely 9:30 in the morning. The gallery was mostly empty, except for a few courthouse regulars, and my sister Emma, who sat in the back row looking like she wished she could disappear entirely. Emma had always been caught in the middle, trying to maintain relationships with both sides of a divide she'd never fully understood. She'd called me 3 times in the weeks leading up to today, begging me to just settle, to take whatever they offered and walk away. She was terrified of what this fight might cost all of us. Parker stood to present their case, his voice carrying easily through the room as he painted a picture of a troubled family member who had systematically withdrawn from all family obligations and responsibilities. He spoke about my failure to visit my grandmother during her final illness, my absence from family holidays and celebrations, my refusal to participate in family business decisions. He made me sound selfish, ungrateful, and undeserving. He wasn't entirely wrong about the facts. I had missed Christmas dinners. I had avoided family gatherings. I had kept my distance from my grandmother during her last months, but facts without context are just weapons in the wrong hands, and Parker wielded them expertly. When he finished, Judge Williams looked down at me from her bench. Her expression was neutral, professional, but I caught something in her eyes that might have been curiosity. Ms. Martinez, you're representing yourself today, is that correct? I stood, smoothing down my dress and picking up my manila folder. Yes, Your Honor. Do you have an opening statement you'd like to make? I looked across the courtroom at my Uncle David. He was leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man watching a foregone conclusion play out exactly as he'd scripted it. My Aunt Linda had her phone out, probably texting updates to family members who weren't present. Michael was already looking at his watch, probably calculating whether this would wrap up in time for his lunch meeting. Your Honor, everything my family's attorney just told you is true. I did miss family gatherings. I did keep my distance. I did fail to visit my grandmother when she was dying. I paused, letting that sink in. But before you decide whether that makes me unworthy of my grandmother's legacy, I think you should understand why. Judge Williams nodded slightly. I'm listening. I opened my manila folder and pulled out a single photograph. It was 8 years old, slightly faded, showing a younger version of myself in a crisp navy blue suit, standing next to a distinguished older man in a government building. We were both smiling, and I was holding a medal in a presentation box. Your Honor, my name is Rebecca Martinez, and 8 years ago, I was a senior investigator with the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The man standing next to me in this photograph is Director Robert Hayes, and the medal I'm holding is the Distinguished Service Medal, awarded for exceptional performance in the investigation and prosecution of complex financial crimes. I could feel the energy in the room shift. Parker's confident posture straightened slightly. My Uncle David stopped leaning back in his chair. Judge Williams removed her reading glasses and looked at me with renewed attention. The case that earned me that medal was a 2-year investigation into a sophisticated money laundering operation that funneled nearly $30 million through a network of seemingly legitimate real estate transactions across Southern California. We traced shell companies, tracked wire transfers, documented false invoices, and built a case that resulted in 14 arrests and the seizure of assets worth $47 million. I turned to look directly at my Uncle David. His face had gone completely pale. The primary target of that investigation was Chen and Associates Real Estate Development, owned and operated by my uncle, David Chen, the man who is now asking this court to deny me my inheritance, because I've been, in his words, a disloyal and absent family member. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys as she processed what she'd just heard. Judge Williams leaned forward slightly. Ms. Martinez, are you telling this court that you conducted an investigation into your own family's business? Yes, Your Honor. And I'm telling you that the reason I've been absent from family gatherings for the past 8 years isn't because I'm selfish or ungrateful. It's because the last time I sat at a family dinner, I was wearing a wire. Parker was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, I object. This is completely irrelevant to the matter at hand. We're here to discuss inheritance distribution, not relitigate some alleged investigation from years ago. But Judge Williams held up a hand to silence him. Her eyes were fixed on me with the intensity of someone who had just realized they were hearing something far more significant than a routine family dispute. Mr. Parker, I think I'd like to hear more about this before I rule on relevance. Ms. Martinez, please continue. I took a breath and returned the photograph to my folder. What I was about to say would change everything, not just for this case, but for my family, for my future, and for the memory of my grandmother, who had died never knowing that her son was a criminal and her granddaughter was the one who had exposed him. Your Honor, in the summer of 2016, I was approached by my supervisors at FinCEN with intelligence suggesting that several real estate companies in the Los Angeles area were being used to launder money for various criminal organizations. The pattern was sophisticated, but detectable if you knew what to look for. Properties purchased with cash by shell companies, held for minimal periods, then sold at artificial prices to other shell companies in the network. Each transaction generating paperwork that looked legitimate, while actually serving to clean dirty money and generate false profits for the participants. I opened my folder again and pulled out a thick stack of documents. When I saw the name Chen and Associates on the preliminary target list, I thought there had to be some mistake. This was my family's business. My uncle David had built it from nothing, starting with small residential properties and growing it into a company that developed strip malls and office complexes across 3 counties. The idea that it could be involved in money laundering seemed impossible. Judge Williams nodded for me to continue. So I volunteered to take point on investigating Chen and Associates, thinking I could quickly clear the company and remove it from our target list. I believed I was protecting my family. I glanced at David again. He was staring at the table in front of him, his hands clenched into fists. What I discovered instead was that my Uncle David had been running one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations we'd ever encountered.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The weight of those words hung in the air like smoke. 8 years of secrets, 8 years of carrying the knowledge of what I'd found, 8 years of being treated like the problem when I was actually the one who had solved it. The Chen and Associates operation was brilliant in its simplicity. David would identify properties that were undervalued or in distressed situations. Shell companies with cash would purchase these properties at below market prices. Chen and Associates would then be hired to manage improvements and renovations, generating invoices for work that was either grossly overpriced or sometimes never actually performed. The properties would then be sold to other entities in the network at inflated prices, creating multiple opportunities to introduce illegitimate funds into legitimate transactions. I pulled out a specific document and placed it on the table where Judge Williams could see it. This is a wire transfer record showing a payment of $230,000 from a company called Pacific Holdings LLC to Chen and Associates for renovation work on a property in Burbank. Pacific Holdings was a shell company controlled by a criminal organization that was moving proceeds from drug trafficking. The renovation work they paid for consisted of painting 2 rooms and replacing a water heater. The actual cost of that work was approximately $4,000. Parker stood again. Your Honor, even if we accept Ms. Martinez's claims about this investigation, I fail to see how it relates to her grandmother's will. Elena Martinez was not involved in Chen and Associates. She was not part of any alleged criminal activity. The question before this court is whether Rebecca Martinez deserves to inherit from her grandmother's estate, not whether her uncle's business practices were questionable. But Judge Williams was studying the documents I'd presented with the focus of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. Mr. Parker, I'm beginning to think these matters might be more connected than you realize. Ms. Martinez, what happened when you discovered this alleged money laundering operation? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The moment when I would have to explain not just what I'd found, but what it had cost me to find it. Your Honor, when I realized the scope of what my uncle was involved in, I faced an impossible choice. I could protect my family by burying my findings and removing Chen and Associates from our investigation. Or I could do my job and pursue the evidence wherever it led, even if it meant destroying the people I loved. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the weight of that decision, the sleepless nights, the way my hands shook when I finally made the call to my supervisor to request authorization for a more intensive investigation. I chose my oath over my blood. I chose justice over loyalty. And for the next 18 months, I systematically built a case against my own uncle that would ultimately result in his arrest, the seizure of his assets, and the destruction of everything my family thought they knew about themselves. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system humming in the background. Emma was crying softly in the back row. David still hadn't looked up from the table. The investigation required me to attend family gatherings while recording conversations. It meant smiling at holiday dinners while documenting criminal conspiracies. It meant hugging my grandmother while wearing surveillance equipment and praying she would never find out that her son was using her grandchildren's trust funds as collateral for money laundering schemes. Judge Williams leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, you said this investigation resulted in arrests. What was the outcome? I pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the United States Attorney's Office for the Central District of California. David Chen was arrested on 14 federal charges, including money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering. He was convicted on 12 of those charges and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with an additional 3 years of supervised probation. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Emma's crying had stopped entirely, replaced by a stunned silence that suggested she was hearing some of these details for the first time. Your Honor, David Chen served 6 years of that sentence before being released on good behavior in 2022. The reason my family believes I've been absent and hostile isn't because I'm selfish. It's because the man who is asking you to deny me my inheritance spent the last 6 years in federal prison because of evidence I gathered and testimony I provided. Parker was on his feet again, but this time he seemed less confident, more desperate. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We're relitigating a criminal case that was resolved years ago. Ms. Martinez's decision to pursue charges against her uncle doesn't automatically entitle her to inherit from her grandmother. If anything, it demonstrates exactly the kind of family hostility and betrayal that supports our petition. But Judge Williams was no longer listening to Parker. Her attention was focused entirely on me and the implications of what I was revealing. Ms. Martinez, you mentioned that your uncle used trust funds as collateral. Can you elaborate on that? This was the part of the story that still made me sick to think about. The discovery that had transformed my investigation from a professional obligation into a personal mission. Your Honor, as part of the money laundering scheme, my uncle needed to demonstrate legitimate assets when establishing credit relationships with criminal organizations. He used property owned by family members, including my grandmother's house, as collateral for loans that were actually mechanisms for laundering money. I opened my folder one final time and pulled out a document that I'd hoped I would never have to use. This is a mortgage document showing a $500,000 loan secured against my grandmother's property in Woodland Hills. The loan was obtained without her knowledge or consent, using forged signatures and fraudulent documentation. My grandmother never knew that her house was being used as collateral for criminal enterprises. The reaction was immediate and explosive. David's head snapped up, his face flushed with anger. That's not true. She knew about the mortgage. She agreed to help with business expansion. The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them, and I could see from Parker's expression that his client had just made a devastating mistake. Judge Williams fixed David with a stare that could have melted steel. Mr. Chen, you are not currently testifying, and I would advise you to consult with your attorney before making any further statements. But the damage was done. In his anger, David had just confirmed that there had indeed been a mortgage against my grandmother's property, contradicting his family's position that they had no knowledge of any criminal activity. I looked at Judge Williams and made a decision that would determine not just the outcome of this case, but the direction of the rest of my life. Your Honor, there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone, not the FBI, not the prosecutors, not even my own family. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Parker looked like he wanted to object but couldn't figure out what grounds he could possibly use. During the investigation, I discovered that my grandmother wasn't just an unknowing victim of my uncle's crimes. 3 months before her death, she figured out what was happening. She found the mortgage documents, she discovered the bank statements, and she confronted my uncle about what he was doing. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, no bigger than a matchbox. This device contains a recording of that confrontation, made by my grandmother without my uncle's knowledge. In it, you can hear her demanding that he stop using her property for criminal activities, and you can hear his response. The courtroom had become so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. Judge Williams was staring at the recorder like it was a loaded weapon. Your Honor, my grandmother didn't just discover what my uncle was doing. She discovered that I was the one who had exposed him. And instead of being angry with me for betraying the family, she thanked me. She told me she was proud of me for choosing right over easy, for choosing justice over comfort. And she asked me to promise her something. I pressed the play button on the recorder, and my grandmother's voice filled the courtroom, clear and strong despite her age, speaking words that would change everything. Mija, I know what you did. I know you were the one who stopped David. I know it cost you everything, and I know the family blames you. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You did the right thing. even when it was hard, even when it hurt. And I want you to promise me something. I want you to promise that you'll never let them make you feel ashamed for doing what was right. You are my granddaughter, and you are exactly who I raised you to be." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Emma sobbing in the back row, and the rustle of papers as Judge Williams made notes on her legal pad. I turned off the recorder and looked at my Uncle David for the first time in 8 years. His face was wet with tears, though whether they were from grief, shame, or anger, I couldn't tell. "Your Honor, my family wants you to deny me my inheritance because they believe I betrayed them. But the woman whose estate we're discussing here today didn't see it as betrayal. She saw it as loyalty to something higher than blood, loyalty to truth and justice and the principles she had tried to teach all of us." Judge Williams set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Ms. Martinez, this recorder, these documents, this investigation you conducted, why are you revealing all of this now? Why didn't you present this evidence earlier in the probate process?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for months as I prepared for this day. "Your Honor, because I hoped I wouldn't have to. I hoped that my family would honor my grandmother's wishes without forcing me to expose the full truth about why our relationships deteriorated. I hoped that even if they couldn't forgive me for what I'd done, they would at least respect what our grandmother wanted." I gestured toward the opposing table where my relatives sat in stunned silence. But they chose to paint me as the villain in a story where I was actually the hero. They chose to claim that my absence from family gatherings made me unworthy of my grandmother's love, when my absence was actually the result of my refusal to pretend that criminal behavior was acceptable just because it was profitable. Judge Williams nodded slowly. "And the medal you mentioned at the beginning of your statement?" I smiled for the first time since walking into the courtroom. The Distinguished Service Medal was awarded not just for the investigation of Chen and Associates, but for my willingness to pursue justice, even when it required investigating my own family. The citation specifically noted that my actions demonstrated exceptional integrity and commitment to the law enforcement mission, even under circumstances of extreme personal cost. I pulled the medal from my folder, still in its presentation case, and held it up for the court to see. "Your Honor, this medal represents the United States government's recognition that I did the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And I'm presenting it to this court as evidence that my grandmother's trust in me was well placed." But as I opened the case to display the medal, something unexpected happened. Judge Williams stood up abruptly, her face pale, her eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned around to see what had captured her attention and felt my heart stop. Standing in the back of the courtroom, near the doors that led to the hallway, were 4 people in dark suits with federal identification badges clearly visible on their jackets. The FBI had arrived. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with short auburn hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen everything twice. She flashed her credentials to the bailiff and whispered something that made him nod and step aside. Behind her, 3 other agents positioned themselves strategically around the courtroom, not threatening, but clearly prepared for whatever might happen next. Judge Williams resumed her seat slowly, her composure intact but her eyes alert. "Agent Thompson, I presume you have a reason for interrupting these proceedings?" Agent Sarah Thompson stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying an authority that filled the room. "Your Honor, we apologize for the interruption, but we've been monitoring this hearing as part of an ongoing federal investigation. Ms. Martinez's testimony has revealed information that directly impacts an active case." My Uncle David had gone completely rigid in his chair. Parker was shuffling through papers frantically, clearly trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled far beyond a simple inheritance dispute. My Aunt Linda was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Agent Thompson continued. "We have reason to believe that the Chen money laundering operation Ms. Martinez investigated was not fully dismantled in 2018. New evidence suggests that some aspects of the network remained active even after David Chen's incarceration." The words hit the courtroom like physical blows. Emma had stopped crying and was staring at the agents with the expression of someone watching her entire understanding of reality collapse in real time. Judge Williams leaned forward. Agent Thompson, while I appreciate the federal government's interest in this matter, we are currently conducting a probate hearing. Unless you have specific evidence that relates to the disposition of Elena Martinez's estate, I'm not sure how your investigation intersects with our proceedings. Thompson nodded respectfully. Your Honor, that's exactly why we're here. We have evidence that Elena Martinez's estate contains assets that were purchased with proceeds from criminal activity that continued after David Chen's arrest. Assets that may need to be forfeited to the federal government. The implication was staggering. If the FBI could prove that my grandmother's property had been purchased or improved using money from ongoing criminal activity, the entire estate could be seized. There would be nothing left to inherit. But something about Thompson's timing bothered me. Federal agents didn't just show up at probate hearings because someone mentioned an old investigation. They were here for a specific reason, and I had a growing suspicion that I knew what it was. Agent Thompson, I said, standing up despite the unusual protocol, how long have you been monitoring this hearing? She looked at me with what might have been approval. We've been aware of the case since it was filed, Ms. Martinez. Your family's petition to exclude you from the inheritance raised some interesting questions about why someone with your background and clearance level would be systematically excluded from family financial matters. Judge Williams interrupted. Ms. Martinez has a security clearance? I nodded reluctantly. I maintained my Treasury Department clearance even after transferring to private sector consulting work. It's required for some of the financial crime prevention contracts I work on. Agent Thompson smiled slightly, which brings us to why we're really here. Ms. Martinez, are you familiar with a company called Golden State Property Management? The name hit me like ice water. Golden State was a shell company I'd identified during my original investigation, but had never been able to fully trace. The connections were too complex, the ownership structure too deliberately obscured. We'd flagged it as suspicious but hadn't been able to develop enough evidence for charges. Yes, I said carefully. It was part of the Chen network, but we couldn't establish direct criminal activity. That's because the real criminal activity didn't start until after David Chen went to prison, Thompson replied. Someone took over the infrastructure he'd built and expanded it dramatically. Golden State Property Management has been the center of a money laundering operation that's processed over $60 million in the past 4 years. My Uncle David was shaking his head vigorously. That's impossible. I've been out of that business entirely. I don't have anything to do with Golden State. But Thompson wasn't looking at David. She was looking at my Aunt Linda, who had gone very still in her chair. Mrs. Chen, according to our records, you assumed control of Golden State Property Management in 2019, approximately 1 year after your husband's conviction. You maintained the existing network of shell companies and expanded operations to include cryptocurrency exchanges and international wire transfers. Linda Chen had always been the quietest member of our family, the one who stayed in the background while David made the decisions and took the credit. She'd been married to him for 23 years, had raised their son Michael, had attended every family gathering with a casserole dish and a polite smile. The idea that she could be running a criminal enterprise was so foreign to everything I thought I knew about her that I almost laughed. But then I remembered something my grandmother had said in one of our last conversations. Something I dismissed at the time as the ramblings of an elderly woman losing her grip on current events. Linda's been asking a lot of questions about the house, she'd said. About the mortgage papers, about who has access to the safety deposit box, about how the trust is structured. She says it's just to help David when he gets out, but something doesn't feel right. At the time, I'd assumed my grandmother was being paranoid, reading sinister motives into what was probably just Linda trying to understand financial matters she'd never had to deal with before. Now I realized my grandmother's instincts had been correct. Thompson pulled out a tablet and swiped to display a document. Mrs. Chen, this is a bank record showing a wire transfer of $470,000 from Golden State Property Management to an account controlled by you, dated 3 weeks after Elena Martinez's death. The transfer memo lists it as a state settlement advance, but our investigation shows the money originated from a cryptocurrency exchange that was processing payments for a fentanyl distribution network. Linda finally looked up from her purse and for the first time in my life I saw my aunt not as the quiet, supportive wife, but as someone who had been calculating angles and managing risks while everyone else focused on David's dramatic fall from grace. "That's not true," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "David handled all the business matters. I just signed papers when he asked me to." "Mrs. Chen," Thompson replied patiently, "we have surveillance footage of you meeting with known money launderers at 3 different locations over the past 18 months. We have recordings of phone conversations where you discuss moving assets and restructuring payment channels. And we have testimony from 2 cooperating witnesses who identify you as the operational leader of the revived Chen organization." Parker was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, my clients haven't been charged with anything. This is speculation and innuendo designed to prejudice these proceedings. I move for an immediate recess so my clients can consult with criminal defense counsel." But Judge Williams was studying the tablet Thompson had handed her, her expression growing more serious with each page she reviewed. "Mr. Parker, these appear to be official federal investigative documents. Agent Thompson, what exactly are you requesting from this court?" "Your Honor, we're requesting that you delay any distribution of Elena Martinez's estate pending a federal investigation into the source of assets used to purchase and maintain the properties in question. We also have arrest warrants for Linda Chen and Michael Chen." The words were barely out of Thompson's mouth before Linda bolted from her chair and ran toward the courtroom exit. She made it maybe 10 steps before 2 agents intercepted her, not roughly, but with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Michael looked around wildly, as if trying to decide whether to run, fight, or just surrender. The decision was made for him when Agent Thompson nodded to her colleagues, who moved to either side of his chair. "Michael Chen, you're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The formal recitation of Miranda rights provided a surreal soundtrack as federal agents handcuffed my cousin in the middle of a probate hearing that had begun as a simple inheritance dispute and had somehow evolved into the culmination of a years-long criminal investigation. Emma was crying again, but these weren't the soft tears of earlier. These were the harsh, desperate sobs of someone watching their entire family structure collapse in real time. David sat motionless, staring at his wife and son being arrested, his face cycling through expressions of shock, betrayal, and something that might have been relief. Judge Williams waited until the agents had secured their prisoners, and the courtroom had returned to some semblance of order before speaking. "Agent Thompson, I need to understand the scope of this investigation and how it affects the matter before this court." Thompson consulted her tablet again. "Your Honor, our investigation suggests that Linda Chen used her access to Elena Martinez's financial accounts to funnel approximately $200,000 in criminal proceeds through the estate. The money was used to pay for renovations to the Woodland Hills property and to purchase investment securities that are now part of the estate being probated." The implications were staggering. If federal prosecutors could prove that part of my grandmother's estate had been contaminated with money from criminal activity, those assets would be subject to forfeiture. The house, the investments, possibly everything could be seized by the government. But there was something else, something Thompson hadn't said, but that was becoming clear as I processed the timeline of events. "Agent Thompson, how long have you known about Linda's involvement in the revived money laundering operation?" She met my eyes directly. "We've been building this case for 2 years, Ms. Martinez, since shortly after you filed your first suspicious activity report as a private consultant." The room went quiet again. Parker looked confused. David looked bewildered. But Judge Williams was nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Williams said slowly, "are you telling this court that you've been working with federal law enforcement on this matter?" I looked at Agent Thompson, who gave me a slight nod of permission. "Your Honor, 18 months ago, I was approached by former colleagues at Treasury who had identified some suspicious financial patterns involving companies that had been connected to the original Chen investigation. They asked me to provide consulting services on a contract basis." "What kind of consulting services?" Judge Williams asked. "Asset tracing, transaction analysis, and behavioral assessment," I replied. essentially helping them understand how the previous money laundering network had operated and how someone might attempt to revive it using existing infrastructure. Agent Thompson stepped forward. Ms. Martinez's knowledge of the original Chen operation made her invaluable in identifying how the network was being reconstituted. Her insights helped us map the new organizational structure and identify the key players. The weight of what had really been happening began to settle on everyone in the room. This wasn't just a probate hearing that had been interrupted by a federal investigation. This was a federal investigation that had been using the probate hearing as a final piece of evidence gathering. "You've been investigating us this entire time," David said, his voice hollow. "Even here, even today, you've been working with them." I turned to face him directly for the first time since the hearing began. "No, Uncle David. I've been investigating the people who stole from my grandmother and used her trust to fund criminal activities. The fact that those people turned out to be your wife and son doesn't change my obligation to see justice done." "But Linda," David said, shaking his head in apparent confusion. "Linda doesn't know anything about the business. She never got involved in any of that." Agent Thompson consulted her tablet again. "Mr. Chen, according to our investigation, your wife has been the operational head of Golden State Property Management since 2019. She recruited your son Michael as her lieutenant in 2020. Together, they rebuilt your money laundering network and expanded it beyond anything you had achieved." David's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information. Confusion gave way to recognition gave way to anger, and anger gave way to something that looked like grudging admiration. "She said she was just managing the paperwork while I was away," he said quietly. "She said she was keeping everything organized so I could rebuild when I got out. I thought she was trying to preserve what was left of the legitimate business." "Mr. Chen," Thompson replied, "Golden State Property Management processed more money in the past 4 years than your original operation handled in 8 years. Your wife is significantly better at this than you were." The compliment, if it could be called that, hung in the air like smoke. Parker was frantically making notes, probably trying to figure out how to represent clients who had just discovered they were married to and related to people they had never really known. Judge Williams cleared her throat. "Agent Thompson, given these developments, what is the federal government's position regarding Elena Martinez's estate?" "Your Honor, we believe that approximately 30% of the estate's current value can be traced to criminal proceeds introduced by Linda Chen over the past 18 months. We'll be seeking forfeiture of those assets, but the remainder of the estate appears to be legitimate." I felt something loosen in my chest. My grandmother's house, her savings, her investment in the family business, the bulk of what she had worked for her entire life, would survive this investigation. The money Linda had stolen and laundered through the estate would be seized, but my grandmother's real legacy would remain intact. But Agent Thompson wasn't finished. "However, Your Honor, there's one more matter we need to address. Ms. Martinez, during your consulting work with our investigation, did you have access to Elena Martinez's financial records?" The question felt like a trap, though I wasn't sure what kind. "Yes, I reviewed bank statements and investment account records as part of tracing the flow of funds through the estate." "And did you discover anything during that review that you haven't shared with this court?" I looked at Judge Williams, then at Agent Thompson, then at the manila folder that still sat on the table in front of me. There was one more document inside, one more piece of evidence that would complete the picture of what had really happened in our family over the past few years. "Yes," I said quietly, "there's something else." I reached into the folder and pulled out a handwritten letter, 2 pages long, written in my grandmother's careful script. The paper was slightly yellowed, and the ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clearly legible. "Your Honor, this is a letter my grandmother wrote to me 6 months before her death. I found it in her safety deposit box when I was conducting asset tracing for the federal investigation." Judge Williams extended her hand. "May I see it?" I handed her the letter and waited while she read it, watching her expression change as she processed the contents. When she finished, she looked up at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Ms. Martinez, would you like to read this letter aloud for the record?" I took the letter back, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded it. The words were familiar. I'd read them dozens of times over the past months, but speaking them aloud in this courtroom, in front of what remained of my family, felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. "Dear Rebecca," I began, my voice steady, despite the emotional weight of the words. "I know you think I don't understand why you've stayed away from the family, but I understand more than you realize. I know what David did, and I know what it cost you to stop him. I know that every family gathering you've missed, every holiday you've avoided, every phone call you haven't returned. It's all been because you couldn't bear to pretend that nothing had changed." I paused, looking up at David, who was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "But I need you to know something, Mija. What David did was wrong, but what you did was right. You chose justice over family loyalty, and that choice saved more people than you'll ever know. I'm proud of you for making the hard choice, and I'm proud of you for living with the consequences." Emma had started crying again, but these tears seemed different, quieter, more thoughtful. "I also need you to know that I've been watching Linda these past few months, and I think she's been involved in things she shouldn't be involved in. I don't have proof, and I don't understand all the details, but something isn't right. She's been asking questions about money and accounts and business matters that she never cared about before. I think she might be trying to continue what David started." The letter continued for another page, but the key revelation was already clear. My grandmother had suspected Linda's criminal activities months before her death. She had been trying to gather evidence, trying to protect the family's legitimate assets from being contaminated by whatever Linda was planning. "The house is yours, Rebecca," I read, my voice growing stronger. "Not because the others don't deserve it, but because you're the only one I trust to make sure it's used for good instead of evil. You're the only one who's proven that you'll do the right thing even when it costs you everything. I'm leaving you in charge of making sure our family's legacy is something we can be proud of." I folded the letter and placed it back on the table. The courtroom was silent, except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Judge Williams took off her reading glasses and cleaned them carefully, a deliberate gesture that gave everyone time to process what they'd just heard. When she put them back on, she looked around the courtroom with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something far more significant than a routine legal proceeding. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said finally, "this has been one of the most extraordinary hearings I've presided over in 23 years on the bench. What began as a simple inheritance dispute has revealed a complex web of criminal activity, family betrayal, and ultimately, a story of someone choosing duty over comfort." Agent Thompson stepped forward. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented today, the federal government withdraws any claim to Elena Martinez's estate beyond the specific assets we can prove were purchased with criminal proceeds. Ms. Martinez's cooperation with our investigation and her clear separation from any criminal activity makes her a legitimate heir to the uncontaminated portions of the estate." Parker stood one final time, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried at the beginning of the day. "Your Honor, my clients maintain their position that Rebecca Martinez should be excluded from inheritance due to her hostility toward the family." Judge Williams fixed him with a stare that could have melted concrete. "Mr. Parker, I've just heard testimony that your client's hostility consisted of refusing to participate in criminal conspiracy and working with federal law enforcement to prevent further criminal activity. If that's your definition of hostility, then I would suggest that hostility is exactly what this family needed." She turned to address the entire courtroom. "Furthermore, I've heard evidence that Elena Martinez specifically wanted Rebecca Martinez to inherit the bulk of her estate, not despite her actions as a law enforcement officer, but because of them. The decedent clearly understood that Rebecca Martinez was uniquely qualified to preserve and protect the family's legitimate legacy." Parker sat down, his case effectively destroyed. Judge Williams continued. "Therefore, it is the order of this court that Elena Martinez's will be executed as written, with Rebecca Martinez receiving her full inheritance as specified in the original document. The federal government will be permitted to seize any assets that can be proven to derive from criminal activity, but the remainder of the estate will be distributed according to Elena Martinez's wishes." She banged her gavel once, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. "This hearing is concluded." As people began to gather their belongings and file out of the courtroom, Agent Thompson approached me with a business card and a slight smile. "Ms. Martinez, excellent work on the asset tracing analysis. If you're ever interested in coming back to federal law enforcement full-time, we could use someone with your skills and integrity." I took the card but didn't commit to anything. "Agent Thompson, how long have you known that this hearing would end with arrests?" She smiled more broadly. "We've been planning this operation for 6 months. Your family's petition to exclude you from the inheritance was actually the final piece of evidence we needed to prove that Linda Chen was actively trying to control assets she knew contained criminal proceeds. By fighting to keep you away from the estate, she essentially confessed to knowing there was something in the estate worth hiding. The irony was perfect. My family's attempt to punish me for exposing criminal activity had ultimately provided the evidence needed to expose even more criminal activity." As Agent Thompson walked away to coordinate the transport of her prisoners, Emma approached me hesitantly. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was clearer than I'd seen it in years. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I've spent 8 years thinking you abandoned us, when really you were trying to save us from ourselves." I hugged my sister for the first time in nearly a decade, feeling 8 years of tension and misunderstanding begin to dissolve. "Emma, you don't owe me anything. I made choices that hurt our family, even if they were the right choices. I should have found a way to explain, to help you understand." She shook her head. "No, you did what you had to do. And grandmother was right. You were the only one strong enough to do it." As we stood in the empty courtroom, surrounded by the detritus of a family's complete transformation, I realized that this hearing had accomplished something I'd never expected. It hadn't just resolved an inheritance dispute. It had finally, after 8 years, allowed me to tell the truth about why I'd made the choices I'd made. More importantly, it had revealed that my grandmother had understood those choices all along. She had seen what I couldn't see at the time, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a family is refuse to enable their destruction. The medal in my folder, the one that had started this entire revelation, represented more than recognition for a job well done. It represented the moment I'd chosen justice over comfort, truth over loyalty, and right over easy. As Emma and I walked out of the courthouse together, I realized that my grandmother's real gift to me hadn't been the house or the money or the investments. Her real gift had been the knowledge that she understood, that she approved, and that she trusted me to continue making the hard choices that would protect what was worth protecting and expose what needed to be exposed. Outside, the California sun was shining, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt like I could finally stop running from my own choices and start living with their consequences. 3 weeks after the hearing, I found myself standing in the driveway of my grandmother's house for the first time in 8 years. The Spanish-style villa looked smaller than I remembered, its cream-colored stucco showing signs of age and the red tile roof missing a few pieces here and there. The garden my grandmother had tended so carefully was overgrown, with rose bushes climbing wild against the front windows and bougainvillea threatening to swallow the mailbox entirely. Emma stood beside me, holding a ring of keys that felt heavier than they should have. The legal paperwork finalizing my inheritance had been completed the day before, but federal investigators were still processing the property to identify and remove any assets that could be traced to Linda's criminal activities. They'd found surprisingly little. Apparently, Linda had been smarter than we'd given her credit for, keeping most of her illegal proceeds separate from family property. "I keep expecting to see her in the window," Emma said quietly, referring to our grandmother's habit of watching for visitors from her favorite chair in the living room. "She used to sit there for hours, especially after David was arrested. I think she was hoping someone would come visit who actually wanted to see her, not just ask for money or favors." The guilt in Emma's voice was palpable. Like me, she had stayed away from family gatherings, though for different reasons. Where I had been excluded, she had excluded herself, unable to handle the tension and choosing to avoid conflict rather than navigate it. We had both abandoned our grandmother in different ways, and neither of us had realized how lonely she'd become until it was too late. "She understood why we stayed away," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to comfort Emma or myself. "The letter she wrote, the things she said to Agent Thompson's informants, she knew the family was toxic. She just didn't know how to fix it." Emma unlocked the front door, and we stepped into a house that felt like a time capsule. Everything was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. The heavy wooden furniture my grandmother had inherited from her mother, the collection of ceramic figurines arranged on built-in shelves, the photographs of family members spanning 4 generations arranged along the mantelpiece. But now there was something else, something that hadn't been there during my last visit in 2016. Stacks of financial documents covered the dining room table. Bank statements, property records, loan agreements, insurance papers, months of careful organization that told the story of someone trying to understand what was happening to her own assets. My grandmother had been conducting her own investigation, using whatever resources were available to an elderly woman with limited financial expertise. She asked me to help her with this, Emma said, gesturing toward the papers. About 6 months before she died. She said the numbers didn't make sense, that money was moving around in ways she didn't understand. I told her it was probably just David trying to protect assets while he was in prison, that Linda was probably just managing things the way any wife would. Emma picked up a yellow legal pad covered in our grandmother's handwriting. Notes about phone calls to banks, questions about account balances, lists of transactions she couldn't explain. The thoroughness was impressive and heartbreaking at the same time. I should have taken her seriously, Emma continued. I should have helped her figure out what was happening. Maybe if I had, we could have stopped Linda sooner. I took the legal pad and flipped through pages of increasingly desperate attempts to understand financial manipulations that would have challenged experienced investigators. My grandmother had been fighting a battle she was never equipped to win, trying to protect her family's legacy with nothing but determination and a growing suspicion that she couldn't trust the people closest to her. Emma, you couldn't have known. Linda fooled federal investigators for 2 years. She fooled David completely. She certainly could have fooled us if we'd been paying attention. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. The signs had been there for anyone who had wanted to see them. Linda's sudden interest in financial matters, her questions about the estate planning process, her insistence on handling David's legal appeals personally rather than letting his attorneys manage everything. The way she had started attending family gatherings even when David couldn't, positioning herself as the family representative while he was incarcerated. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the house room by room, trying to separate items that had sentimental value from those that would need to be sold or donated. Federal investigators had already removed anything that might be evidence, but they'd been respectful of the fact that this was someone's home, not just a crime scene. In my grandmother's bedroom, we found something that stopped us both in our tracks. Hidden in the back of her closet, behind winter coats that smelled of mothballs and memories, was a wooden box I recognized from childhood. She'd called it her treasure box, and it had always contained the things that mattered most to her. Photographs of her late husband, letters from friends, small gifts from grandchildren, certificates and awards from her volunteer work at the community center. But when Emma opened it, we found something unexpected. Tucked beneath layers of tissue paper was a manila envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's careful script. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings about the original Chen investigation, articles about money laundering prosecutions, and printouts of news stories about financial crime prevention. At the bottom of the pile was a photograph I'd never seen before. It showed me at age 8, standing in this very house during a family Christmas gathering. I was wearing a red dress that my grandmother had bought me, and I was holding up a trophy I'd won for a school science fair project about forensic accounting techniques. Even at 8 years old, I'd been fascinated by how numbers could tell stories and reveal truths that people tried to hide. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, were the words, "She always knew how to find the truth. I'm proud of the woman she became." Emma looked over my shoulder at the photograph and started crying again. "She saved articles about your work. She kept track of everything you did, even when you weren't speaking to the family. She was so proud of you, Rebecca. She just didn't know how to tell you." The weight of 8 years of misunderstanding settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. My grandmother had never stopped loving me, had never stopped believing in the choices I'd made, had never stopped hoping that someday the truth would vindicate the pain our family had endured. She'd watched from a distance as I rebuilt my career and my life, and she'd died knowing that I was exactly who she'd raised me to be, That evening, Emma and I sat on the back patio drinking coffee from cups our grandmother had used every morning for 20 years. The yard was overgrown, but you could still see the structure of the garden she'd maintained so carefully. Rose bushes, fruit trees, herbs planted near the kitchen window so she could harvest them while cooking. "What are you going to do with the house?" Emma asked. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks, ever since Judge Williams had ruled in my favor. The property was worth over $2 million, enough to provide financial security for the rest of my life. I could sell it and use the money to expand my consulting business, or keep it as an investment property, or move in and start over in a place that held so many complicated memories. "I want to turn it into something that would make her proud," I said. "Something that helps people the way she always tried to help people." Emma nodded. "What did you have in mind?" I'd been developing the idea slowly, letting it take shape as I processed everything that had happened in the courtroom and everything I'd learned about my grandmother's final months. A resource center for families dealing with financial crimes. A place where people can get help understanding complex investigations. Where they can find support when they discover that someone they trusted has been stealing from them. The concept was still rough, but the need was real. During my years as a federal investigator, and later as a private consultant, I'd seen countless families destroyed not just by the crimes themselves, but by their inability to understand what had happened and what their options were. Elderly people whose life savings had been stolen by relatives. Small business owners whose partners had been embezzling for years. Families who discovered that their homes had been used as collateral for criminal enterprises they'd never known existed. "You could call it the Rebecca Martinez Center," Emma suggested. The name felt right immediately. My grandmother had spent her entire life trying to help her community, volunteering at literacy programs and food banks, organizing neighborhood watch groups, teaching English to new immigrants. She'd believed that everyone deserved dignity and support, especially when they were facing circumstances beyond their control. Over the following weeks, I began developing the concept more seriously. I reached out to former colleagues at Treasury and FBI who specialized in victim services. I contacted lawyers who worked on asset recovery cases. I spoke with social workers who helped families navigate the emotional aftermath of financial crimes. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Everyone I talked to had encountered families who needed exactly the kind of comprehensive support I was proposing. Legal aid societies were overloaded and couldn't provide the specialized knowledge required for complex financial crime cases. Government victim services were focused on immediate needs rather than long-term recovery. There was a genuine gap in available resources. Agent Thompson was particularly enthusiastic when I called her to discuss the idea. "Rebecca, this is brilliant. We've been struggling for years with how to help families understand what's happening during investigations. Most of the time, they feel like they're being victimized twice, once by the criminals and once by the legal system. Having a place where they could get explanations and support from people who actually understand these cases would be invaluable." She also provided information that helped me understand the scope of the problem. Financial crimes affected over 3 million American families each year, according to FBI statistics. The average victim lost approximately $47,000, but the emotional and social costs were often much higher. Families fell apart, trust was destroyed, and people lost faith in institutions that were supposed to protect them. My grandmother's house would be perfect for the kind of intimate, supportive environment I wanted to create. The large living room could accommodate group sessions where people could share their experiences with others who understood what they were going through. The dining room could be converted into a resource library, with guides to understanding different types of financial crimes and navigating various legal processes. The bedrooms could be turned into private consultation spaces, where people could work one-on-one with specialists who could help them understand their specific situations. But the most important space would be the kitchen, where my grandmother had always done her best work. She'd believed that people were more honest and more hopeful when they were sharing food, and I wanted to preserve that philosophy. The Rebecca Martinez Center would always offer coffee and homemade cookies to anyone who walked through the door, just like my grandmother had done for 60 years. As I worked on developing the center's mission and structure, I found myself thinking more and more about the choices that had led me to this point. 8 years ago, when I'd made the decision to investigate my own family, I thought I was choosing between loyalty and justice. between love and duty. I'd believed that doing the right thing would cost me my family forever. What I hadn't understood then was that real love sometimes requires you to oppose the people you care about. That real loyalty sometimes means refusing to enable destructive behavior. That real family isn't defined by blood or shared secrets, but by shared values and mutual respect. My grandmother had understood this all along. She'd watched her son make choices that put money before morality, that valued profit over people, that prioritized comfort over conscience. She'd seen the damage those choices were causing, not just to the victims of his crimes, but to everyone who loved him and had to live with the consequences of his actions. When I'd chosen to expose David's crimes, I'd thought I was betraying my family. But my grandmother had seen it differently. She'd recognized that I was trying to save my family, trying to prevent the corruption from spreading, trying to preserve something worth preserving in a situation where everything seemed lost. The letter she'd left me had made this clear. You chose justice over family loyalty, and that choice saved more people than you'll ever know. She hadn't seen my actions as betrayal. She'd seen them as rescue. Now, as I planned to convert her house into a place that would help other families navigate similar crises, I realized that she'd been preparing me for this moment my entire life. Every story she'd told me about standing up to bullies, every lesson about the importance of honesty, every time she'd encouraged me to ask difficult questions and seek complicated answers, it had all been leading to this. The Elena Martinez Center would be more than a resource center for crime victims. It would be a testament to the idea that families can survive the truth, that love is strong enough to withstand accountability, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destruction. 3 months after the hearing, I received a phone call that I'd been expecting but dreading. David had been released from federal custody and wanted to meet with me. He'd served additional time for violating his parole conditions through his connection to Linda's operation, but prosecutors had ultimately determined that he'd been genuinely unaware of his wife's activities. He was, they concluded, guilty of poor judgment and willful blindness, but not of active participation in the revived money laundering scheme. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Pasadena, neutral territory that held no memories for either of us. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, somewhere public enough to feel safe but private enough to have a real conversation. I hadn't seen him since the day of the hearing, when he'd sat frozen in shock as his wife and son were arrested in front of him. He looked older than his 63 years when he walked in, his hair completely gray now and his face marked by the kind of deep lines that come from prolonged stress rather than natural aging. He'd lost weight during his most recent incarceration, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame. But his eyes were clearer than I remembered, less calculating, more genuinely present. "Rebecca," he said, sitting down across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I nodded, not sure how to respond. Part of me had been angry with him for 8 years, angry about the crimes he'd committed and the way he'd torn our family apart. But another part of me just felt sad for a man who'd lost everything through his own choices and was now trying to figure out how to rebuild some semblance of a life. "I need to apologize," he said without preamble. "Not just for what I did to you 8 years ago, but for what I put the whole family through. For the choices I made that led to all of this." I waited for him to continue. "I spent 2 years in prison the first time thinking that you'd betrayed me. Thinking that blood should have been thicker than justice. That family loyalty should have mattered more than the law. I was angry at you for choosing your career over your family." He paused to take a sip of coffee, his hands shaking slightly. But sitting in that courtroom, watching Linda and Michael get arrested, seeing the evidence of what they'd been doing, I realized that I'd been wrong about everything. You didn't betray the family, you tried to save it. And I was too proud and too stupid to see the difference. The apology was more than I'd expected, and less than I'd needed. It was genuine, but it came 8 years too late to undo the damage that had been done to our relationships and our family structure. "Uncle David," I said carefully, "I appreciate the apology. But I need you to understand something. When I decided to investigate Chen and Associates, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to do my job. And when the investigation revealed criminal activity, I had a choice to make between protecting you and protecting the victims of those crimes. I chose to protect the victims. He nodded. I know, and I know that was the right choice, even though it took me years to admit it. Do you really know that? I asked. Because for 8 years you've acted like I was the problem. You've excluded me from family gatherings, refused to speak to me at funerals, and now you've tried to have me cut out of grandmother's will. If you really believed I did the right thing, why did you spend so long punishing me for it? The question hung in the air between us. David stared out the window for a long moment, watching traffic move past on Colorado Boulevard. Pride, he said finally. Shame. Fear that if I admitted you were right, I'd have to face how wrong I'd been about everything else. It was easier to blame you than to take responsibility for the mess I'd made. It was an honest answer, maybe the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. David, I don't need you to take responsibility for choices I made. I knew what investigating you would cost me, and I made that choice anyway. But I do need you to stop punishing other people for the consequences of your own actions. He looked confused. What do you mean? Emma, I said. She's spent 8 years caught in the middle of this conflict, trying to maintain relationships with both sides while understanding neither side completely. She's been carrying guilt and confusion and pain that aren't hers to carry. If you really want to make amends, start by helping her heal from the damage your choices caused. David nodded slowly. You're right. Emma shouldn't have had to choose sides in a fight she didn't start. And there's something else, I continued. I'm turning grandmother's house into a resource center for families dealing with financial crimes. I want to help people navigate the kind of situation our family went through. If you're serious about making amends, I could use your help. He looked surprised. What kind of help? You understand how these criminal networks operate from the inside. You know how family members get recruited, how people get pressured into participating, how the psychological manipulation works. That knowledge could be valuable in helping other families recognize dangerous situations before they get as far as ours did. The suggestion was risky. Involving David in the center would be complicated, potentially controversial, and would require me to trust someone who had given me many reasons not to trust him. But it would also be consistent with my grandmother's philosophy that everyone deserved a chance at redemption, that people could change if they were given the opportunity and support to do so. Rebecca, I don't know if I'm the right person for something like that. I don't know if people would trust advice from someone who was convicted of the same crimes they're trying to avoid. Maybe not, I agreed. But maybe your experience could help some families understand that good people can make terrible choices when they're under pressure, or when they're blinded by greed or fear. Maybe hearing from someone who's been where their family members are could help them find ways to intervene before it's too late. David was quiet for a long time, considering the offer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd heard it since childhood. I'd like to try. I'd like to do something positive with what I've learned, something that might help other people avoid the mistakes I made. As we left the coffee shop that afternoon, I realized that forgiveness isn't a single moment or decision. It's a process, a series of choices to engage with someone despite their past actions, to believe in their capacity for change, while remaining realistic about their limitations. I wasn't ready to trust David completely, but I was willing to give him the opportunity to prove that he'd learned from his mistakes. More importantly, I was ready to model the kind of compassion and second chances that my grandmother had always believed in. She'd never stopped hoping that her family could heal, that her son could become the man she'd raised him to be, that love could ultimately triumph over the damage caused by poor choices and misplaced priorities. The Rebecca Martinez Center wouldn't just be about helping families affected by financial crimes. It would be about demonstrating that healing is possible, that families can survive truth-telling, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their actions while still believing in their potential for redemption. As I drove home that evening, past the courthouse where this entire story had reached its climax, I thought about the medal that had started it all. The Distinguished Service Medal had represented recognition for doing the right thing under difficult circumstances. But now I understood that the real recognition hadn't come from the government or from awards or from public acknowledgement. The real recognition had come from my grandmother, who had seen what I couldn't see at the time, that choosing justice over comfort, truth over loyalty, and accountability over enablement wasn't betrayal at all. It was love in its most demanding and most necessary form. The center would open in 6 months, funded by my inheritance and supported by a network of professionals who believed in its mission. It would be small at first, serving just a few families at a time, but it would grow as word spread, and as more people discovered that they didn't have to navigate financial crime investigations alone. And somewhere in that house that had held so many secrets and so much pain, new stories would be written. Stories of families finding ways to heal, of truth-telling that led to restoration rather than destruction, of love that was strong enough to survive accountability. My grandmother would have been proud. 6 months later, the Rebecca Martinez Center opened its doors on a warm Tuesday morning in April. The transformation of my grandmother's house had been more extensive than I had originally planned, but every change had been made with respect for the home's history and the woman who had loved it for 40 years. The living room had become a welcoming space with comfortable seating arranged in circles rather than rows, designed to encourage conversation rather than formal presentations. The walls were painted in soft earth tones, and my grandmother's favorite photographs still hung in their original places, though now they were accompanied by inspirational quotes about courage, truth, and resilience. The dining room had been converted into a resource library, with books on financial crime, legal guides written in plain language, and binders full of case studies that could help people understand their situations without feeling overwhelmed by legal jargon. The built-in china cabinet now held informational brochures instead of dishes, and the long wooden table where my family had shared so many complicated meals was now used for workshops and planning sessions. Emma had helped me design the kitchen as the heart of the center, just as it had been the heart of our grandmother's home. We'd kept the original appliances but added a large coffee station and expanded counter space for laying out documents and materials. The kitchen was where people felt most comfortable opening up about their fears and concerns, where difficult conversations happened over cups of coffee and plates of cookies made from our grandmother's recipes. The first family to use the center's services arrived at 9 o'clock that morning. Maria Santos was 73 years old, a retired seamstress whose son had been embezzling money from her bank accounts for 2 years. She'd discovered the theft when she tried to withdraw money from medical expenses and found that her savings account, which should have contained $40,000, held less than $300. Maria sat in my grandmother's favorite chair, clutching a tissue and looking around the room with the kind of wariness that comes from having your trust violated by someone you love. Her daughter Carmen sat beside her, equally devastated but trying to maintain composure for her mother's sake. "I don't understand how this happened," Maria said in heavily accented English. "Roberto is a good boy. He's always been responsible with money. He has a good job, a nice apartment. Why would he take money from his own mother?" It was a question I'd heard variations of dozens of times over the years, from elderly parents whose adult children had stolen their retirement funds, from business owners whose partners had been embezzling, from spouses who discovered that their marriages had been built on financial deception. The shock of learning that someone you trust has been stealing from you is profound and disorienting, especially when that person is family. "Mrs. Santos," I said gently, "addiction changes people in ways that are hard to understand if you haven't experienced it yourself." According to the police report, Roberto has been struggling with gambling addiction for several years. When people are addicted, they make choices they would never make under normal circumstances. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it might help explain why. Carmen leaned forward. "But how do we protect my mother's remaining assets? Roberto still has access to some of her accounts. He has keys to her house. He knows all her personal information. Even if he's arrested, what's to stop him from continuing to steal from her?" This was where the center's comprehensive approach made a real difference. I'd assembled a team of specialists who could address every aspect of financial crime recovery. A banking expert who could help freeze accounts and establish new ones with enhanced security. A legal aid attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. A social worker who understood the family dynamics involved in financial exploitation, and a financial planner who could help people rebuild their economic security. More importantly, we had David. My uncle's involvement in the center had started slowly and carefully. For the first 3 months, he'd worked behind the scenes, helping me understand the psychological patterns that led people into financial crimes, reviewing case materials to identify warning signs that families might miss, and developing educational materials based on his first-hand experience with money laundering operations. But as word about the center spread and more families began seeking our services, it became clear that David's perspective was uniquely valuable. He could explain the mindset of someone who rationalizes stealing from family members, could help relatives understand how good people convince themselves that criminal behavior is acceptable, and could offer realistic assessments of whether someone was likely to change their behavior or continue their destructive patterns. "Mrs. Santos," David said, entering the living room with a fresh pot of coffee, "I'd like to share something with you, if you're comfortable hearing it. I spent several years making choices very similar to the ones your son has been making. I took money that didn't belong to me, I lied to my family about what I was doing, and I told myself that I would pay it all back eventually." Maria looked at him with curiosity rather than judgment. David's appearance was reassuring. He looked like someone's grandfather, dressed in a cardigan and khakis, with kind eyes and patient demeanor that came from years of learning to live with the consequences of his actions. "The thing I want you to understand is that your son probably feels terrible about what he's doing. He probably tells himself every day that this is the last time, that he'll find a way to replace the money, that he'll get his gambling under control and never steal from you again. But addiction makes it almost impossible to keep those promises." Carmen interrupted. "So you're saying there's no hope? That he'll just keep stealing until there's nothing left?" David shook his head. "No, I'm saying that hope has to be realistic. Your brother needs professional help for his gambling addiction, and he needs to face legal consequences for what he's done to your mother. But those things have to happen, whether or not he wants them to happen. You can't wait for him to decide to get better on his own." It was exactly the kind of honest, informed guidance that families in crisis needed, but rarely received. Social services agencies were overwhelmed and understaffed. Legal aid attorneys had too many cases to provide comprehensive support. Police departments were focused on prosecution rather than prevention. The Elena Martinez Center filled a gap that had been invisible until you experienced it personally. Over the following months, we worked with Maria's family to secure her remaining assets, pursue legal action against Roberto, and develop a long-term plan for her financial security. Roberto was eventually arrested and convicted of elder abuse and embezzlement. He served 18 months in county jail and was required to pay restitution and attend gambling addiction counseling. More importantly, the family was able to maintain their relationships while still holding Roberto accountable for his actions. Maria learned to love her son while refusing to enable his addiction. Carmen learned to support her mother while protecting herself from her brother's manipulative behavior. And Roberto, eventually, learned to accept responsibility for his choices and work toward genuine recovery. It was exactly the kind of outcome my grandmother would have hoped for: justice tempered with compassion, accountability balanced with forgiveness, and truth-telling that led to healing rather than permanent estrangement. As the center's reputation grew, we began receiving referrals from unexpected sources. Agent Thompson sent us families whose cases had been resolved through the criminal justice system, but who still needed help rebuilding their lives. Judge Williams referred people who appeared in her courtroom facing civil litigation related to financial crimes. Even the district attorney's office began suggesting that victims contact us for support services that weren't available through traditional government programs. One of the most challenging cases came to us in late summer. The Hendersons were a middle-class family from Riverside, whose teenage daughter had been recruited by an online romance scammer who convinced her to steal money from her parents' credit cards and bank accounts. Over the course of 6 months, she'd transferred nearly $20,000 to someone she'd never met but believed was her boyfriend. The family dynamics were explosive. Jim Henderson was furious with his daughter and wanted her prosecuted to the full extent of the law. His wife, Carol, was devastated by the financial loss, but more concerned about their daughter's emotional state. Their daughter, Ashley, was humiliated, defensive, and convinced that everyone was overreacting to what she saw as a misunderstanding rather than a crime. "She knew exactly what she was doing," Jim said during their first visit to the center. She's 17 years old, not 7. She stole from us deliberately and repeatedly. The fact that she was stupid enough to believe some scammer's lies doesn't excuse what she did. Carol was crying softly in the chair next to him. But she's our daughter. She made a mistake. A terrible mistake, but still a mistake. Pressing charges against her won't bring our money back. It'll just destroy her future. Ashley sat slumped in her chair, alternating between defiant anger and heartbroken sobs. You don't understand. Tyler loves me. He was trying to help his sick mother. He's going to pay everything back as soon as he can get access to his trust fund. This is all just a big misunderstanding. The case required every resource the center had developed. Ashley needed education about how romance scams work and why intelligent people fall victim to them. She needed counseling to help her process the emotional manipulation she'd experienced and to understand that being victimized by a scammer didn't excuse her theft from her parents. Jim and Carol needed help understanding how their daughter had been psychologically manipulated while still holding her accountable for her choices. David's perspective was particularly valuable in this case. Ashley, he said during one of our group sessions, I want you to understand something about the person who convinced you to steal from your parents. He's a professional criminal who specializes in finding young people who are lonely or insecure and manipulating them into committing crimes for him. Ashley looked skeptical. Tyler isn't a criminal. He's just someone who needed help. Ashley, I spent years convincing myself that my criminal behavior was justified by circumstances. I told myself that I was helping my family, that I was solving problems, that I was being smart and resourceful. But the truth was that I was lying to myself because the lies were more comfortable than the reality. David pulled out a folder and showed Ashley printouts of social media profiles, court documents, and FBI wanted posters. The person you know as Tyler has used at least 6 different names and has scammed dozens of young women like you. He's currently wanted in 3 states for fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. The photographs he sent you were stolen from a modeling agency. The stories about his sick mother and his trust fund are scripts he uses with all of his victims. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Ashley stared at the documents for several minutes, her face cycling through emotions as she processed the reality of her situation. When she finally looked up, the defiance was gone, replaced by a combination of shame, anger, and devastating heartbreak. How could I be so stupid? She whispered. You weren't stupid, I said firmly. You were manipulated by someone who is very good at manipulation. The fact that you fell for his lies doesn't mean you're stupid. It means you're human. Over the next several months, we worked with the Henderson family to develop a plan that balanced accountability with support. Ashley was required to get a part-time job and contribute to repaying the money she'd stolen. She attended counseling to help her understand how she'd been victimized and to develop better judgment about online relationships. Her parents learned about romance scams and other online threats so they could help protect Ashley and her younger siblings. Most importantly, the family learned to separate Ashley's poor judgment from her fundamental character. She had made terrible choices, but she wasn't a terrible person. She had been manipulated and exploited, but she was still responsible for her actions. She needed consequences for what she'd done, but she also needed support and forgiveness as she worked to rebuild trust with her family. The case took almost a year to resolve completely, but the outcome was worth the investment. Ashley graduated from high school and enrolled in community college with plans to study cybersecurity, inspired by her experience to help protect other people from online scams. Jim and Carol's marriage survived the stress of the crisis and emerged stronger as they learned to work together to support their daughter. The family's financial situation stabilized as Ashley contributed to restitution and as they implemented better security measures for their accounts. As I watched the Henderson family rebuild their relationships and their lives, I thought about the conversation I'd had with my grandmother during my last visit before her death. She'd been worried about young people she saw in her neighborhood, kids who seemed to be making dangerous choices without understanding the long-term consequences. They need someone to help them see the bigger picture, she'd said. Someone who can explain how small choices lead to big problems, and how you can get trapped in situations that seem impossible to escape from. The Elena Martinez Center was providing exactly that kind of guidance, not just to families dealing with financial crimes, but to the broader community. We'd started offering workshops on identity theft prevention, online safety, and financial literacy. We'd partnered with local schools to provide education about cybersecurity and digital citizenship. We'd even begun working with the probation department to provide services to people who had been convicted of financial crimes and were trying to rebuild their lives. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the center's work was the way it allowed people to transform their painful experiences into something useful for others. Maria Santos began volunteering as a peer counselor for other elderly victims of financial exploitation. Carol Henderson developed a support group for parents whose children had been involved in online scams. Even Ashley, once she'd processed her own experience, started speaking at high schools about the reality of romance scams and how to recognize emotional manipulation. David's transformation was the most remarkable of all. The man who had once rationalized stealing from his own family members was now dedicating his life to helping other families avoid the same destructive patterns. He'd completed additional training in addiction counseling and victim services. He'd written a guidebook for families dealing with financial crimes, sharing insights that could only come from someone who had been on both sides of the situation. "I can't undo the damage I caused," he told me during one of our regular check-ins. "But I can use what I learned to help other people make better choices than I did. And maybe that's a form of redemption that actually matters." The center's success had attracted attention from other communities interested in replicating our model. We'd received inquiries from victim services organizations in Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon, all wanting to understand how we'd developed such a comprehensive approach to financial crime recovery. I'd been invited to speak at conferences and workshops, sharing what we'd learned about helping families heal from betrayal and financial exploitation. But the most gratifying recognition came from an unexpected source. Judge Williams called me in December, 8 months after the center had opened, to tell me that she'd been monitoring our outcomes and was impressed by what she was seeing. "Rebecca, I've been on the bench for over 20 years, and I've seen thousands of families torn apart by financial crimes. Most of them never really recover. The victims remain bitter and suspicious, the perpetrators repeat their behavior, and the families never learn to trust each other again. But the families who've worked with your center seem to be beating those odds." She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "I'm recommending the Elena Martinez Center for a state grant that would allow you to expand your services and train other organizations to use your model. I think what you've built here could make a difference for families throughout California." The grant would provide funding for 3 additional staff members, expanded facilities, and a training program that could help other communities develop similar resources. It would allow us to serve more families directly while also multiplying our impact through partnerships with other organizations. As I hung up the phone after that conversation, I walked through the center's rooms, thinking about how much had changed since that morning in the courthouse, when I'd first revealed my grandmother's letter and my Treasury Department medal. The house that had once held so many secrets and so much pain had become a place of healing and hope. In the living room, a support group was meeting for families affected by elder financial abuse. In the kitchen, David was counseling a young man whose gambling addiction had led him to embezzle from his employer. In the resource library, a mother was researching legal options after discovering that her ex-husband had been stealing from their children's college funds. Each of these families was facing the kind of crisis that had once seemed insurmountable to me. The discovery that someone they trusted had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. But unlike my family 8 years ago, they had somewhere to turn for guidance, support, and hope. My grandmother's dream of a family that could survive truth-telling, that could choose love over loyalty to destructive behavior, that could find ways to heal even after devastating betrayals, was becoming reality for dozens of families every month. The Elena Martinez Center wasn't just serving individual clients. It was proving that a different kind of family dynamic was possible, one based on honest accountability rather than enabling silence. As I locked up the center that evening and walked to my car, I thought about the letter my grandmother had written to me months before her death. "You chose justice over family loyalty. and that choice saved more people than you'll ever know. At the time, I'd interpreted that as validation for the investigation that had led to David's arrest. But now I understood that she'd been talking about something bigger. She'd been talking about the ripple effects of choosing truth over comfort, accountability over enabling, and healing over hiding. The Rebecca Martinez Center was those ripple effects made visible. Every family we helped, every person who learned to set healthy boundaries with destructive relatives, every young person who recognized manipulation before it was too late, every victim who found the courage to seek justice, all of it could be traced back to a decision I'd made 8 years ago to investigate my own uncle rather than look the other way. My grandmother had seen what I couldn't see at the time, that choosing the right thing over the easy thing doesn't just affect one situation or one family. It creates a legacy of integrity that can benefit people you'll never meet, in ways you'll never fully understand. The medal in my desk drawer represented recognition for one investigation. But the center represented something much more important. Proof that painful experiences can be transformed into sources of healing, that broken families can learn to love each other in healthier ways, and that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can become the foundation for the most meaningful work of your life. Tomorrow, 3 new families would walk through our doors, carrying their own stories of financial betrayal and broken trust. They would find coffee and cookies and comfortable chairs. They would find resources and expertise and practical guidance. But most importantly, they would find proof that families could survive the truth, that healing was possible, and that sometimes the people who understand your pain best are the ones who have walked the same difficult path and emerged stronger on the other side. 2 years after opening the Rebecca Martinez Center, I found myself standing in a different courthouse, this time as an expert witness in a case that would test everything we'd learned about financial crime prevention and family healing. The prosecution had called me to testify about patterns of financial exploitation in family businesses, and as I waited outside the courtroom, I reflected on how different this felt from that morning, when I'd walked into Judge Williams' courtroom carrying nothing but a manila folder and years of suppressed truth. The case involved a construction company where the owner's son had been systematically stealing from employee pension funds for 3 years. The amounts were staggering. Over $4 million had been diverted to support the son's cryptocurrency speculation and luxury lifestyle. What made the case particularly complex was that the business owner, Frank Morrison, genuinely hadn't known about his son's activities until employees started complaining about missing pension contributions. As I entered the courtroom, I saw familiar patterns playing out. The family was divided, with some members supporting the father and others believing he must have known what was happening. The victims, construction workers who had trusted their employer with their retirement security, were angry and demanding justice. The perpetrator, 28-year-old Derek Morrison, sat at the defense table looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. But what struck me most was the presence of other family members in the gallery, people who had clearly been torn apart by the discovery of Derek's crimes. An older woman who must have been his grandmother sat in the front row, clutching a tissue and staring at her grandson, with the expression of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. Beside her, a young woman with Derek's eyes held a toddler who kept asking loudly when they could go home. During my testimony, I explained how financial crimes within family businesses typically develop gradually, with small boundary violations escalating over time, until massive theft seems almost inevitable. I described the psychological patterns that allow good people to rationalize increasingly serious crimes, and the warning signs that family members often miss because they're too close to the situation to see it clearly. Dr. Martinez, the prosecutor asked, in your experience, is it possible for a business owner to be genuinely unaware that a family member is embezzling significant amounts of money? Yes, I replied, thinking of my own uncle's genuine shock when he'd learned about Linda's activities. Especially when the perpetrator has legitimate access to financial systems, and when there's a high level of trust within the family structure. People tend to see what they expect to see, and most parents don't expect their children to be stealing from them. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on whether Frank Morrison could have detected Derek's crimes if he'd been more diligent about oversight. It was a fair question, and one that families dealing with similar situations struggled with constantly. How much supervision is reasonable? At what point does appropriate trust become willful blindness? Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that basic financial controls would have prevented this theft entirely? Yes, that's correct. But implementing those controls requires someone to recognize that they're necessary. Most family businesses operate on trust rather than surveillance, especially between parents and children. The tragedy isn't that Frank Morrison failed to prevent something he didn't know was happening. The tragedy is that Derek Morrison violated that trust so completely. After my testimony, Frank Morrison approached me in the hallway. He was in his 60s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades in construction work, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about life proven wrong. Ms. Martinez, I heard about the work you're doing with families like ours. Would you be willing to talk with my family? We're falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it. 3 weeks later, the Morrison family came to the Elena Martinez Center for their first consultation. The group included Frank and his wife Margaret, Derek's sister Jennifer, and Derek's grandmother Rose. Derek himself was still awaiting sentencing and wasn't ready to participate in family counseling, but the others needed help processing what had happened and figuring out how to move forward. The dynamics were painfully familiar. Frank was struggling with guilt, wondering if he'd failed as a father by trusting Derek too much. Margaret was angry at everyone, at Derek for his crimes, at Frank for not detecting them sooner, at herself for not asking more questions about their sudden improvement in family finances. Jennifer was caught between loyalty to her brother and sympathy for the employees he'd victimized. Rose was simply heartbroken, unable to reconcile the grandson she'd loved with the criminal he'd become. I keep thinking about all the times Derek talked about expanding the business, Frank said during our first group session. He had these big plans for new equipment, additional crews, maybe even opening a second location. I thought he was being ambitious and forward-thinking. I had no idea he was planning to fund those expansions with stolen money. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. But there were signs, Frank. The expensive clothes, the new car, those weekend trips to Las Vegas. We should have wondered where the money was coming from. Derek told us he was doing well with investments, Jennifer interjected. He showed us charts and graphs, talked about cryptocurrency trading strategies. It all seemed legitimate. This was where David's perspective proved invaluable once again. Derek was creating a narrative that justified his lifestyle while deflecting suspicion, he explained to the Morrison family. It's a common pattern among people who are stealing from family members. They become very good at providing explanations that sound reasonable, especially to people who want to believe them. David pulled out a notebook and showed the family a timeline he'd constructed based on their descriptions of Derek's behavior. Look at this progression. Derek started by taking small amounts to cover personal expenses. When that worked without detection, he moved to larger amounts to fund investments. When the investments failed, he took even more money to try to recover his losses. Each step seemed logical to him at the time, but the overall pattern shows someone spiraling out of control. Rose, who had been mostly silent during previous sessions, finally spoke up. But why didn't he just ask for help? If he was in financial trouble, if his investments weren't working out, why didn't he come to us? We would have helped him. It was the question that haunted every family dealing with financial betrayal. Why do people choose to steal from the people who love them, instead of simply asking for help? Mrs. Morrison, I said gently, shame is incredibly powerful. Derek probably convinced himself that he could fix the problem before anyone found out. He likely told himself that he would replace the money before it was missed, that he would find a way to make his investments profitable, that he could solve the crisis without anyone ever knowing it had existed. But it got worse instead of better, Margaret said. The longer it went on, the more money he took. That's because the underlying problem wasn't really money, David explained. It was Derek's inability to accept failure and ask for help. Each theft was an attempt to avoid admitting that he'd made mistakes, that his investment strategies weren't working, that he needed guidance and support. Over the following months, we worked with the Morrison family to rebuild their relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Frank learned to separate his love for Derek from his accountability for Derek's choices. Margaret learned to process her anger in ways that didn't damage her relationships with other family members. Jennifer learned to support her brother's recovery without enabling his continued irresponsibility. Most importantly, they learned that Derek's crimes didn't define their family's character or their love for each other. They could acknowledge that Derek had made terrible choices, while still believing in his capacity for change. They could hold him accountable for the damage he'd caused, while still offering him support as he worked to rebuild his life. Derek was eventually sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the affected employees. The family business survived, though it required significant restructuring and the implementation of financial controls that should have been in place years earlier. Frank stepped back from day-to-day operations, bringing in professional management to ensure proper oversight of all financial activities. But the most meaningful outcome was that the family stayed together. Rose continued to visit Derek in prison, bringing him books and letters from other family members. Jennifer maintained contact with Derek while also volunteering at the center to help other families navigate similar crises. Margaret and Frank's marriage not only survived the stress of Derek's crimes, but became stronger as they learned to communicate more openly about difficult topics. As I watched the Morrison family heal and rebuild, I thought about how different their experience had been from my own family's crisis 8 years earlier. They'd had access to resources and support that we'd never known existed. They'd been able to process their trauma in the company of other families who understood what they were going through. Most importantly, they'd been able to see that recovery was possible, that families could survive devastating betrayals and emerge with their love intact. The center's success had attracted attention far beyond California. We'd received inquiries from victim services organizations across the country, all wanting to understand how we developed such effective methods for helping families heal from financial crimes. I'd been invited to speak at conferences in Washington, Chicago, and Atlanta, sharing our model with professionals who worked with crime victims in their own communities. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Agent Thompson called me on a Thursday afternoon in late spring to tell me that the Treasury Department was creating a new victim services initiative based on our work at the Rebecca Martinez Center. Rebecca, we've been tracking the outcomes for families who've worked with your center compared to those who've only received traditional victim services. The difference is remarkable. Families who work with you are significantly more likely to maintain relationships, less likely to experience repeat victimization, and much more successful at rebuilding their financial security. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. The department wants to fund pilot programs in 10 cities across the country, using your model as the template. We'd like you to serve as the national coordinator for the initiative. The offer was flattering and professionally exciting, but it would require me to step back from direct service work at the center to focus on program development and training. After discussing it with Emma and David, I decided to accept the position while maintaining my connection to the original center. I think grandmother would approve, Emma said when I told her about the decision. She always believed that the best way to honor someone's memory was to multiply the good they'd done in the world. The national expansion began 6 months later, with pilot programs launching in Denver, Phoenix, Dallas, Nashville, Jacksonville, and 4 other cities. Each location was unique, adapted to local needs and resources, but all shared the core principles we'd developed: comprehensive support for entire families, peer counseling from people who'd experienced similar situations, practical assistance with legal and financial recovery, and a focus on healing rather than just coping. David became the lead trainer for the national program, traveling to each pilot site to share his insights about the psychology of financial crimes and the process of rehabilitation. His transformation from perpetrator to healer had become a powerful example of the possibility for redemption, and his ability to explain criminal thinking patterns from personal experience made him an invaluable resource for other counselors. I never imagined that the worst decisions of my life could become the foundation for the most meaningful work I've ever done, he told me during one of our planning meetings. But I guess that's what redemption really means. Not erasing your mistakes, but transforming them into something that helps other people avoid making similar ones. As the second anniversary of the Rebecca Martinez Center approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. It had started with a decision to investigate financial crimes in my own family, a choice that had cost me relationships and left me isolated from people I loved. But that same choice had ultimately led to work that was helping hundreds of families navigate similar crises with better outcomes than mine had achieved. Emma and I decided to host a celebration at the center, inviting all the families we'd worked with over the past 2 years to share their stories and reconnect with each other. The event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in May, with food provided by a catering company owned by one of our former clients who'd rebuilt his business after his partner's embezzlement conviction. The turnout was overwhelming. The center's rooms filled with people who had survived financial betrayals and emerged stronger, families who had learned to love each other in healthier ways, and individuals who had transformed their painful experiences into sources of strength and wisdom. Maria Santos brought homemade tamales and spent the afternoon teaching other elderly clients how to recognize common financial scams. The Henderson family arrived with Ashley, who was now studying cybersecurity and had developed an anti-fraud app as her senior project. The Morrisons came as a group, including Derek, who had been released on parole and was working to rebuild relationships with the employees his crimes had affected. But the most moving moment came when Judge Williams arrived unexpectedly, carrying a framed proclamation from the county recognizing the Rebecca Martinez Center's contribution to victim services and family healing. "Rebecca," she said, presenting me with the proclamation, "2 years ago you walked into my courtroom carrying a medal and a folder full of painful truths. Today, you've transformed that pain into a resource that's helping families throughout the state rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud." As the celebration continued around us, I stepped outside to the backyard where my grandmother had maintained her garden for so many years. The space had been transformed into a memorial garden, with plaques honoring families who had found healing through the center's services, and a bench where people could sit quietly when they needed a moment of peace. I sat on that bench as the sun began to set, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from inside the house. These were the voices of people who had survived the worst kind of betrayal: theft by family members, lies from people they trusted, violations of their most fundamental assumptions about love and loyalty. But they had also discovered that survival was possible, that healing could happen, and that families could emerge from crisis stronger than they'd been before. The medal that had started this entire journey was now displayed in the center's main hallway, not as a symbol of my accomplishments, but as a reminder that choosing truth over comfort, accountability over enabling, and justice over loyalty sometimes requires courage, but it also creates possibilities for healing that wouldn't exist otherwise. My grandmother's letter, the one that had revealed her understanding and support, was framed next to the medal. Her words, "You chose justice over family loyalty, and that choice saved more people than you'll ever know," had proven prophetic in ways neither of us could have imagined at the time. As I sat in her garden, surrounded by the sounds of families who had learned to love each other through crisis rather than despite it, I realized that the most important inheritance she'd left me wasn't the house, or the money, or even the validation of her letter. It was the example of someone who believed that people could change, that families could heal, and that the most loving thing you could do was sometimes the hardest thing. The Rebecca Martinez Center would continue to grow and evolve, serving more families and training more counselors and expanding to new communities across the country. But its true legacy would always be measured in relationships restored, trust rebuilt, and love that proved strong enough to survive the truth. As the stars began to appear in the California sky, I made a silent promise to my grandmother that I would continue the work she had started in her own quiet way, helping people find the courage to face difficult truths, supporting families through their darkest moments, and proving that accountability and love aren't opposites, but partners in the slow, necessary work of healing. The families inside the house were living proof that her faith in human resilience had been justified. They had faced betrayal and chosen forgiveness, encountered lies and chosen truth, experienced devastation and chosen hope. They were the real heroes of this story, the ones who had done the hardest work of all, learning to love each other in ways that made everyone stronger. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.